Hi folks, Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about something that seems to be doing the rounds at the moment, the police state in the West. Do we have a police state? So I'll come back to that in a minute. But something I want to highlight and can't sort of overemphasize really is that a police state can only come about and is the direct product of ideological government. Where you have government by consent of the people, it's almost impossible to have a police state. It's only in ideological governments that a police state exists. Or a government or a system of government where they perceive themselves under siege from every direction, then you have a police state. In cases of warfare where imminent invasion is suspected or believed is about to occur, things like that. But outside of that, it's only in ideological governments where the police state exists. Now, an ideological government in itself cannot be government with the consent of the people. If it's ideological, then consent isn't required. It's imposed on the people, and because ideological government is a substantial departure from the natural organic development of power and human relations and wealth creation, because it's a departure from that, then people generally aren't going to agree to it, don't like it. And so it has to be imposed by force. And the way it's imposed by force is through the police state. So we need to understand that relationship. A government that is not by consent of the people and is an ideological government must have a police state to enforce the ideology and to ram it down the throats of the populace, which is where we are largely in the West now. There are still some vestiges remaining of consent of the governed, but only remaining vestiges. It's no longer a core issue. The big issues of our time, mass migration, race, gender, and LGBTQ hustling and grifting, all these things that I decided and determined and arrived at ideologically and then forced upon us. We do not have a say. And in the case of, for example, school, parent-teacher associations and school boards and things like that, if anyone complains about graphic gay lesbian porn being taught to 5-year-olds, then they're being treated effectively as political terrorists, and they're subject to arbitrary arrest or the SWAT team arriving. And also, if people that say they believe in don't believe in free and easy abortions, for example, Christian groups and so on, then they're similarly, the SWAT team can arrive at your door. But if you go and trash the office, anyone goes and trash the office of a pro-life group, then the police don't care. So we've got this thing where the ideology is being brutally enforced by the apparatus of the state, including the Justice Department's FBI, prosecutors, judges, SWAT teams in full body armor appearing to arrest a single 75-year-old woman or something, these sorts of dramatic, with the media being tipped off to, we arrested a fucking Nazi. It might have been a 75-year-old granny that could barely walk, but it doesn't matter. She's a fucking Nazi. So this sort of stuff's going on all over the place. And we don't need, I think, any further proof of the ideological nature of this. So an ideological government must have a police state to enforce and punish and terrorize the public into compliance, which is, again, where we're at now. Nobody wants the mass migration, for example, but it's not only being forced on the Western citizenry without their consent. It's being done in open and flagrant defiance of the will of the people. Just consider that for a moment. Consider what consent of the government means. Then look at the mass migration as being forced on the Western people, not only without their consent, but in flagrant defiance of the wishes of the people. Just let that sink in. And that'll give you an idea as to the extent to which Western governments have been hijacked by ideology, of course, with the World Economic Forum and so on being the, if you like, the I won't call it intellectual, because that seems to bestow too much credit to it, but the sort of the central corrupt brain, if you like, of this is is the guys like the World Economic Forum, or they're fronting for the boys that are making, the boys downtown making the decisions, who are all white, by the way. So this relationship between ideological government, imposed authority, not with the consent of the people, and then of course the police state. I wouldn't have thought it was possible in the West, but it is now. What is a police state? We need to sort of maybe just look at that. It's arbitrary enforcement of the law. So if you're a climate change protester, you don't get punished for breaking the law. But if you're somebody who's complaining about mass migration, then the full brutal force of the law. If you're someone who rigs elections to produce outcomes that the globalists want, then nothing's going to touch you. The law is irrelevant to you. But if you question or protest the rigged election, then you get put in prison. So these are the sorts of things. These are the manifestations. If you support putting gay, lesbian propaganda, graphic sexual propaganda into 5-year-olds at school, then the law won't touch you. If you complain about it, then you will be arrested. So these are the examples of. So the rule of law is not applied equally. It's applied ideologically rather than by the law. Now, laws, when they come with consent of the governed, are well, this is the intention at least. The laws are worded, precisely. The words have meaning, and they're enshrined in law. So laws are codified. So it's clear any member of the public can read that law and say, well, I can take care not to transgress or whatever the case may be, or if I do this, I will be I'll be breaking the law, or I'll be violating the law, and so I may suffer the following penalty. So the penalty is prescribed clearly, the law is codified clearly, and is applied equally to all citizens, and the penalties are applied equally to all citizens. So if the penalty is a $10 fine, then everyone is fined $10 that meets that criteria. Or if the criteria is, assuming someone's found guilty in an independent court of law, then the criteria could say it's, I don't know, a year in prison or something. Then everyone gets a year in prison that breaks the law or commits that crime, or is found to be guilty of committing that crime. Also, the idea of judges being independent and to apply the law. So the law has words; they're written, and I suppose there's some wiggle room for a judge there. But in effect, the purpose of the law, the purpose of the courts rather, was to have independent, impartial judges that would follow the law. Now, there wasn't always so. It took many hundreds of years of legal experience and practice and failure. The failures of the Spanish Inquisition, all these sorts of things like this. These were failures of the law to be applied, and instead, failures of it to be like reversing the burden of proof, or assuming the intent of the person. You wanted to be in league with the devil, didn't you? And these types of things, Salem witch trials. But over time, Oliver Cromwell in the English Revolution, arm twisting the Privy Councillors in Parliament to agree to the killing the king, chopping his head off. And so these are examples where the politicization of justice was also looked at as being a no-no. Now, some of this was really brokering the deal, saying, well, one day we'll be in power and then we might use this against you. So the idea, maybe we should all get together and just agree that we won't politicize justice. So in that way, all of us are protected from such tyranny. That's broken down today as well. That's completely gone. The idea of putting activist judges in the courts is now de rigueur for the globalists. That's how you bring about the changes. That's how you politicize the law. That's how you brutalize people you don't want. That's why if you complain about a rigged election on January 6th, you go to prison. But if you go and torture an entire neighbourhood because you're a race hustler, grifter, activist, then you don't get any penalties. Or you may get a misdemeanor level penalty, or maybe not even that. So we need to always understand a relationship. A police state is arbitrary law, so enforcing it against people you don't like, whereas letting people who break the law on the other side off, or the politicization through the courts, through the prosecutors, the district attorneys, through the Justice Department, using the organs of state to terrorize people. And also, people of ordinary means, you've only got to drag them through a 3-week court case and they're bankrupted for life. The government can use taxpayer revenues to sort out their vindictive, evil asshole vendettas against private citizens who committed no crime, but that private citizen's committed no crime, done nothing wrong. They're just targeted for having the wrong beliefs. They can be bankrupted quite easily by just a week or 2 or 3 weeks in court, and bankrupt, and they'll never recover from that. Or it's unlikely they'll ever recover. I just want to talk about the difference between codified law and ideological law when we look at 2 totalitarian regimes. Now, I've mentioned this in previous vids. I knew some people who came from like Hungary and Czechoslovakia and so on, and they were teenagers when the Nazis arrived in town, and they were also teenagers when the communist Soviets arrived, in 1945. So now it's interesting their comments about, and by the way, 2 out of 4 or 3 out of 5, anyway, the majority of the people were actually Jews. So Jews that had happily survived the Nazi regime and also had experienced both the Nazis. Now, you'd think being Jews, they'd have very little to say that's positive about the Nazis and have a lot more that's positive about the Soviet communists when they came. The Nazis had quite a limited, narrow range of ideology, whereas the Soviets, it was an entire sort of system of ideology and government. So there's differences there, but the Nazis still had, for example, courts that weren't politicized, whereas the Soviets, communists didn't. So things like that. So anyway, and now these are the views of teenagers, but nonetheless they're relevant. When this is a Jewish guy. So when the Nazis arrived, they codified the law. They were very clear about this is the law, precisely written. If you break the law, these are the penalties. So they had a very clear codified law. Now, their ideological stuff was narrowly confined to saying, well, we're a superior race, and by the way, here are the achievements of the German race, and going back to the time of the Romans even, and these achieved, particularly in modern times, in terms of engineering and industry and chemicals and metallurgy and a whole range of things. The achievements were very impressive. So there's no question that whether or not that means it's a superior race or not, you could debate that point. But they did back it up. So we believe we're a superior race, and they back it up. But their ideology is quite narrow around that. It didn't extend into other areas or outside of that, or race relations in terms of Jewish relations to Gentile. Obviously, there was an issue there, and gypsy homosexuals and whatever. But outside of that, their ideology didn't really come into it, or they wouldn't attempt to tamper with the lifestyle going on in, for example, Hungary. Hungary was nominally an ally, really, and they were supplying troops to go and do the Russian campaign, as a case in point. So anyway, the Nazi officials will sometimes come in. This one guy, not a Jew, but a Gentile, his father was like a local mayor or local village heavy of some sort, and the Nazis would sometimes come around and with a list, we've got a list of Jews here. But they didn't push it. And he was in the office, this teenager guy, he was in the office sometimes when the Nazi officials would come by, and he found them, in his recollection, they were very polite, and they weren't rude. They were quite respectful to his father, who again was a local official. I think this was somewhere in a town near Budapest. So anyway, the father would say, no, we need this person, they're the local dentist, or this person's important because they're the local, I don't know, pharmacist, or he would point out that the Jewish people involved had important jobs in the community, or ones that the local officials designated as important. and so they couldn't be disturbed in that. And as this kid recalls, or when he was a kid at the time, recalls the Nazi officials never pushed it. It was just a polite request and nothing more. And if his father said no, then they accepted that no, and off they went, and there wasn't any threats or pressuring or gun to the head or anything like that. So that was his recollection of it. But the Jews recall it somewhat the same. When I asked the Jewish guy what you preferred. Did you prefer now remember, it's a Jewish guy, for goodness sakes. What did you prefer, the governance of the Nazis or the Soviet communists? And he didn't even hesitate. It was the Nazis. I prefer the Nazis, even though he's Jewish. Why did he prefer the Nazis? It's because they were quite clear in the laws that they had and the rules that they had, and they published them quite clearly worded. This is if you transgress here, then we'll punish you, and the punishments were prescribed. So the Soviets, the communists, were different. They'd pretend to be your friend. They'd say they were trying to do good things, but instead they were quite the opposite. Let's have a town hall meeting. This government is your government. You're the people. You decide. We want you to tell us what you want. And then people would get up and say, well, I think we should have this, and I think you should spend more money on, I don't know, fixing potholes in the road and this sort of stuff. And the Soviet commissars, the secret police, would be amongst the thing, and they'd take notes of who was talking and say, well, this person is quite persuasive. They would have the ability to influence other people, and they're not dyed-in-the-wool communists. So we have to take them out the back and shoot them. So all the people that stand up at the town hall meeting and talk and think that they're contributing to their community were whisked away in the middle of the night and murdered by the secret police. The Nazis didn't do that. And he cited various other examples of the difference between the Nazis and the communists. And again, I say, this is a Jewish guy. He preferred the Nazi administration to the communist administration, the Soviet communists. The Nazis, as long as you didn't break the law, the Nazis didn't really care. And if you were Jewish and if you had an important job and that sort of thing, or a job that was like relevant to industry or the war effort or something like that, then they would leave you alone. Now, if you were a second-hand pots and pans merchant and you were Jewish and homosexual, your situation was not good, and let's be clear about that too. But this is Jewish people preferred the Nazis over the Soviet communists. You think, well, that's impossible, but there you go. That's what these people were telling me, at least. They did accept they had a higher risk of being killed just for being Jewish with the Nazis around. That was something they accepted, but just that. They had a higher risk of that. But with the Soviet communists, they had an infinitely higher risk of being murdered or imprisoned or destroyed in some way for suspected wrongthink. The Nazis too had at least a semblance of the burden of proof before they'd come and arrest you or anything like that, whereas the Soviet communists didn't. Arbitrary arrest was just how it was. So again, we're looking at a much more ideological type of government with the Soviet communists, and therefore a police state was an absolute necessity for that. You've been a Taskless today, your Pushback channel. Thank you for listening.